understanding how to obtain the last row and the last column from a range of cell or from a range of reference in Excel is extremely important and one of the cornerstone of VBA. So in this episode, we will be exploring on how to find the last row and the last column from a range of cell. So in this case, we will be touching in particularly on continuous range. Okay, continuous range meaning that range of cell that is continuous, and it's not like you have one range A here, and then you have another range that is separated from the first range, right? So we're discussing strictly in the context of continuous range. As I said, in the event of non-continuous range, we will have to use the used range, okay? And that is something that we will be discussing in future episodes, all right? Okay, so we'll be talking about used range and current region, but in this particular episode, we will be just talking about referencing obtaining last row and last column from a continuous range, okay? So sub last row and last column, okay? This is for continuous range, okay? It's important because I've seen a lot of people who have been confused about the difference between continuous and non-continuous, etc. So that's why in my VBA playlist, I spend a lot of time emphasizing that there is a difference between a continuous and non-continuous range, and there is an approach as to how we decipher the situation for both instances. Okay, so to find the last row and the last column, we will be using the simple formula, a built-in formula in Excel, and it's something that we have already touched earlier, which is the rows dot count. All right. Okay. So let's talk about row. Okay. For rows. Okay. We will use the rows dot count, and for columns to find the last column, right? We will be using the columns dot count. Okay, right? So what exactly is rows dot count? Okay, because I want to make sure that you guys understand what you are doing in the future, right? Okay, so that's why to take an extra moment. It's fine, never mind, right? To just make sure, right? So rows dot count is actually used to count the number of rows in a range. All right, that is one of the ways we use rows dot count. So for example, I can just dim number row range, okay, just to get the number of rows in a range, okay, and I'm just gonna copy it because I'm way too lazy to type it. All right, okay, so row range is the equivalent of, for example, sheet 1, correct? So this is the code name of the sheet, right? So this is the code name, and it just so happened that the tab name is also sheet 1. So, but as I've stated before, if the sheet that you're referring to is on the same workbook as the macro that you're writing on, right? So meaning that if the sheet and the macro are on the same workbook, you could just use the code name. But in every other instance, if the sheet you're referring to is outside the workbook of the macro that is being written, then you have to use the tab name. And that's something we will discuss in the future as well. Okay, so in this instance, it's the same. So I'm just going to refer it by its code name. So sheet 1 dot range D5. It's just an arbitrary, random, completely random range. So what do you think this is going to give us, right? Number row range, sheet 1 dot range d5 dot rows dot count. These will actually give us, the number of rows in the range d5 to d13. Okay, so if I just debug.print this, I'm going to copy it right here. I'm going to paste it into the immediate window, and all I'm going to do is just add the debug.print, and I'm going to hit enter. And as you could see, it's returning me the results 9, meaning that we have 9 rows in the range of d5 to d13. So 13 minus 5, including the 5, you have 9, right? So yeah, that's pretty much spot on, right? So that's one way we use the rows.count. But the rows.count and also similarly columns.count can also indicate the last row and the last column in the Excel workbook. All right, so let's go into that. Okay, rows.count and columns.count can also mean the last row and column in the Excel workbook. For example, I'm just going to say debug.print rows.count and debug.print columns.count, right? And let's just take both of these and paste it into the immediate window. And I'm going to write one. And yeah, that makes sense because in Excel we have about 1 million rows, and that's the results that is returning us here. And we have about 16,000 columns in a typical Excel worksheet. All right. So it can also mean the last row and column in the Excel workbook. So you would ask me, okay, but how is it relevant to find the last row and column in a range? All right. So this is when we're going to combine it with the row and column. All right. So what is row and column? Not rows and columns, the plural form, row and column. Row and column are used to obtain the current row and column of a cell, right? Of a cell address. For example, if I have debug, but just write this, debug.print sheet1.range d5.row. And similarly, if I just put debug.print sheet1 using the code name, okay, d5.column, what do you think we're going to get? What we're going to get is the corresponding row and corresponding column of the cell D5. Am I right? So I'm just going to hit enter. You can see 5 because we're in D5, so that's row 5. And column 5, I would expect it to return 4 because A, B, C, D is the fourth letter in the alphabetical order, right? So D is the fourth column. That's right. So we are going to combine the rows.count or the columns.count with the rows and the row and column in the case of the last column, right? So let's find the last row. The last row of a range of cell. Okay, so for example, I'm just going to write dim L row as long. L row is just sheet 1 dot range. Okay, we're gonna get the last row for the column D, right? Because more often than time, just a second. Because more often than time, when we set up a table, they are usually symmetrical, right? Meaning that a table would have the equivalent number of rows in its column, right? For example, in column D, if you have 21 rows, you would expect the same in column L, right? So that's the reason why we can just use column D as our anchor point or as a reference point. So that's the reason why I'm just going to say D, and I'm going to add the command rows.count. What does rows.count do? Rows.count returns us the number of rows in the Excel workbook, right? So we are actually going all the way D and rows.count, which is actually 1 million, right? So you'll tell me, well, that's not the last row in the Excel workbook. The last row in the range that we're referencing to, but no worries, okay? I'll explain to you how we're going to integrate the whole thing together. So we're going to say D and rows.count, and then we're going to add this function and Excel up. What does this does is it brings us, it goes all the way down, and then it returns us back Excel up dot row, right? So it returns us back to the row, the last row from the bottom of the Excel workbook, which was row 1.4 million or 1.1 million. So it goes all the way down to row 1.1 million. And then it and Excel up. It jumps all the way back up to the last row. And that is the row that we are trying to obtain. That is the last row of the range of our cell, right? So I can prove it to you. We can just use debug.print. We're going to debug.print this. We're going to copy this and we're going to paste it. And I'm just going to copy this and paste it into the VBA editor just to prove that we are right. And we have 21, which means the last row of a continuous range of this particular range is the number 21. That is the last row, okay? So this is an extremely important skill. A very important thing you have to understand in Visual Basic application. Getting the last row and getting the last column. Because more often than times, when we develop applications, the range of the cells are continuously growing, meaning that it's completely dynamic. So we want to iterate from the first to the last row. And the last row, as I've said, is completely dynamic. It's changing. It's being added every single day, by whomsoever is in charge of the workbook. And they want to be able to run the macro and obtain an analysis from the first row all the way up to the last row, or the equivalent of the entire range of the cell. So in this context, we're talking about a continuous range, right? In the upcoming video, we'll talk about obtaining last row of a non-continuous range, okay? But this is how we do it for a continuous range. Now let's talk about column. How do we get the last column of a range of cells? Well, I could just say dim L column as long, and L column is just going to be sheet1 dot range. Well, we're going to do the same thing, all right, but we're not going to use range because, range is, if you're going to use this notation, we're going to say, well, it has to start with a letter, but we're not sure what the column that we're on, because we're trying to get the last column. So this is why we don't use, just gonna write something extra. We don't use the range A or whatever, range A or B and the number notation, okay? We don't use this as we have done with the row, but we use the second form of referencing a cell range, which is we use the cells row number and the column number, right? That is the notation that we're using, right? Remember that there are basically two types of notation. We have the range to reference a cell, and then we have the cells. This basically, if you're saying cells 2 and 3, that means that we're on rows 2, column 3, right? That's the equivalent of range B3, right? So familiarize yourself with that, okay? So dim L column as long, and L column is simply going to be sheet 1 dot cells, and I'm going to say that we're going to find the last column of just this row again, because by the virtue of symmetry, so we're just going to say row 5, and then we're going to add columns dot count, similar to what we've done with the row. And then basically what columns dot count does is it's going to bring us all the way to the end of the worksheet, right? Which was the last column is column 16,000 or whatever it is. And then we're going to use this command, nxl to left, right? We're going to use this command to bring it all the way back to the last column. So it's going all the way to the right, and then it's coming back all the way to the left to the last used column, right? This is how we get the last column of a range of a continuous cell. So if I prove it to you. We're just going to debug.print this. We're going to debug.print this. We're going to copy this. We're going to paste it. And then we're going to copy this and we're going to paste it into the immediate window. And what do you think we're going to get? 15. Exactly, right? That is the column, the last column that we're on, right? The last column. So if you do column O, right? Column O is the equivalent of column 15, right? So we have column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, right? We have 15 columns. So we're in the 15th column. O is the equivalent of 15 in the alphabetical order, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, right? So that's about it, about how to find the last row and the last column of a continuous cell range. So make sure you familiarize yourself with the two ways of referencing a range notation, using the range A, B, or whatever, and concatenating it with the number of the column number, the row number. And also the second notation of referencing a cell address, basically using cells, opening a bracket, row number, comma, column number, right? I hope you guys have learned something. I'll see you in the upcoming video. We have a lot of ground to cover in this highly comprehensive and completely free Visual Basic application course tailored just for you guys. Take care, guys. I'll see you.